A Minsk court has sentenced former Belarus presidential candidate Svetlana Tikhonovskaya to 15 years in prison in absentia.
Fighting intensifies in the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, while life in the region for civilians has grown increasingly difficult.
A month after the devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria, living conditions remain harsh for those who survived.
Qatar is back in the spotlight as the EU's watchdog asked the European Commission to provide details on business trips made by its senior members.
South Korea is to compensate Koreans enslaved by Japanese companies during Tokyo's 35-year colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula.
A Minsk court has sentenced former Belarus presidential candidate Svetlana Tikhonovskaya to 15 years in prison in absentia. She is accused of multiple crimes, including conspiracy to seize state power and incitement of social discord. Authorities began cases against Tikhonovskaya and other Belarus opposition figures after disputed elections in 2020, which led to mass protests and a corresponding brutal crackdown. The court also handed down an 18-year sentence in a penal colony to Pavel Latushko, who's in exile. He's the former Belarusian ambassador to France. Tikhonovskaya has called the trial and other similar cases against opposition figures a farce and revenge on the part of Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian president.
Russia claims it is tightening its hold on the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, with constant pounding on the main routes in and out of the city. Ukrainian forces still control Bakhmut, but a top commander described the situation as hell, although his forces claim to have stabilised the front lines on the outskirts. In his nightly address, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said Kyiv's troops were in a, quote, painful and difficult battle in the eastern Donbass region, including Bakhmut.
Дякую всім, чиє життя дає порятунок життя України. Особливо відзначую сьогодні за хоробрість, міцність та незламність воїнів, які б'ються на Донбасі. Одна з найтяжчих битв, болісна і важка.
For the civilians in the region, life has grown increasingly difficult. People are forced to cook in the street, many of them living in basements without electricity, heating or water.
Нет, мы не бесстрашные. Это неправда. Мы тоже боимся. Мы тоже боимся. Мы живые люди. Нам тоже хочется жить. Очень хочется жить. И так хочется, чтобы быстрее все это закончилось как-то. Или договорились, или, я не знаю, надо как-то этот вопрос решать. Но это ж просто невыносимо.
Moscow appears determined to seize Bakhmut as part of its wider aim of capturing the entire Donbass region. But both sides say they are running out of ammunition.
Ukrainian forces may be conducting a limited fighting withdrawal in eastern Bakhmut and are continuing to inflict high casualties against the advancing mixed Russian forces. The Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut remains strategically sound. It continues to consume Russian manpower and equipment as long as Ukrainian forces do not suffer excessive casualties. The Institute for the Study of War says Ukrainian forces are unlikely to withdraw from Bakhmut all at once and may pursue a gradual fighting withdrawal to exhaust Russian forces through continued urban warfare. Now, the think tank says Russian forces are unlikely to quickly secure significant territorial gains when conducting urban warfare, which usually favors the defender. The Bakhmut city center is located on the western bank of the Bakhmutka River, and Russian forces will need to fight through the area if they're unable to advance directly north or south of Bakhmut to the west of the city center after 9 months of highly attritional, slow Russian advances in this area. The Institute for the Study of War says it is still too early to assess Ukrainian intentions concerning a complete withdrawal from the city. In this area, Ukrainian forces are holding their positions with a distance of around 4 kilometers apart. The Russian offensive to capture Bakhmut will likely culminate whether Russian forces capture the city or not, and the Russian military will likely struggle to maintain any subsequent offensive operations for some months. The Institute for the Study of War adds the likely imminent culmination of the Russian offensive around Bakhmut, the already culminated Russian offensive around Vuhledar, and the stalling Russian offensive in Luhansk region are likely setting robust conditions for Ukrainian counter-offensive operations.
Turkey is still reeling a month after the devastating earthquake of February the 6th, described by the WHO as the worst natural disaster in Europe in a century. The historic heart of Antakya is completely in ruins. Rafet Yavrum is the local leader there and says he's lost a lot of his community and neighbours.
Nedim Kavlak öldü. Doktor, eşi, çocukları. Hepsi gitti abi daha. Konuşamıyorum. Burada kaldım. Ayrılmayacağım buradan.
The earthquake has affected 14 million people, 1/6 of the population. Of these, 3.3 million have had to leave the affected areas, according to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Nearly 2 million people are currently living in tents or containers.
Okay.
Ortam sağlanmış ama küçük, işte maalesef deprem olduğu için idare edebilecek kadar şey sağlanmış yani.
The 7.8 magnitude earthquake followed 9 hours later by another 7.6 magnitude quake, killed nearly 46,000 people and injured 105,000 in Turkey. Another 6,000 are dead in Syria. It also destroyed 214,000 buildings.
First the European Parliament, now the European Commission, as the EU's trouble related to Qatar continues. The bloc's watchdog has asked the Commission to provide details on business trips made by its senior members, after the Director General of its Transport Department, Heinrich Holloley, reportedly travelled several times at the expense of the Qatari government. It happened while the Commission was negotiating an EU-Qatar air transport agreement that now allows all Qatari airlines to operate direct flights to and from any European airport, and vice versa. The Commission recognised that the trips were paid by Qatar, but denies any conflict of interest given that Heinrich Holloley was not directly involved in the negotiations. Either way, these kind of invitations have to be cleared, and in this case, it was Holloley himself who authorised the trips.
When it comes to the Director General, as head of department, he is in charge of assessing whether there is a potential for conflict of interest involved in the mission that we are talking about. So in other words, he himself is the authorizing officer who is supposed to conduct this analysis. This is the procedure.
While the EU watchdog chief Emily O'Reilly underlines how the Director General ultimately takes responsibility for these negotiations, some MEPs in the European Parliament are pushing for absolute clarity on the matter.
Abstentions. La Commission aujourd'hui reconnaît qu'il y a un problème de fonctionnement, notamment avec ses règles internes de voyage et notamment de ses fonctionnaires. Et donc, j'espère que ça va avancer dans le bon sens, notamment pour la transparence sur ces questions.
The European Commission has until June to answer the questions of the EU Ombudsman as it carries out its investigation.
South Korea announced Monday a plan to compensate Koreans enslaved to work for Japanese companies in Japan during its 35-year colonial rule of the Korean peninsula. The proposal, announced by the Foreign Ministry, seeks to resolve one of the most contentious issues in the relations between the two countries.
지금 엄중한 국제 정세와 글로벌 복합 위기 속에서 외교, 또 경제, 또 안보 모든 분야에서 한국과 일본 간의 협력이 대단히 중요합니다.
The Japanese government says it appreciates the measures announced as an effort to restore healthy relations between Japan and South Korea. Although Tokyo insists all wartime compensation issues were settled under the 1965 treaty, Washington, for its part, has welcomed the agreement it described as historic. But it's not been praised by all. Civic groups and victims protested outside the South Korean Foreign Ministry in Seoul. They have expressed their disappointment in the plan, which in principle exempts the Japanese companies from apologising or compensating them directly. Seoul says around 780,000 Koreans were subjected to forced labour during the 1910 and 1945 Japanese occupation.
Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Athens on Sunday over the deadly train crash in Larissa, which killed at least 57 people, mainly students. Tear gas and stun grenades were used when violent clashes broke out between police and demonstrators outside the Greek parliament. The crowds gathered after calls by rail workers and public sector employees to express their grief and anger. Flowers were laid on the tracks at a railway station in northern Greece to honour the victims of those who died in the tragedy.
At least 10 people have died, including 9 police officers in Pakistan. Local officials in the southern province of Balochistan say a suicide bomber rammed into the side of a police truck some 150 kilometres east of Quetta. 22 officers were on board. While no group has yet claimed responsibility for the attack, the region is prone to unrest where the Balochistan Liberation Army and other small separatist groups have long demanded independence from the central government in Islamabad.
Supporters of the late leftist president Hugo Chavez of Venezuela have paid tribute to him and his legacy on the 10th anniversary of his death. Thousands of people packed an old military barracks housing the remains of the iconic socialist leader. Chavez died on the 5th of March 2013 after a long battle with cancer and handpicked current president Nicolás Maduro to be his successor. Since then, Venezuela has been fighting a crisis aggravated by the collapse of its petrol industry, which has caused 7 million people to emigrate.